Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Geek-Stew, and today, guys, welcome back to Horror Stew. That is right. So today, guys, is going to be less of a review game video or a description video. Honestly, today, guys, I'm just really going to be naming off some games that are in a line of games that I've kind of been reading about and looking and hearing about. So for people who don't know what I'm talking about, there is a concept called a clone. All right, it's when you take items or you take themes or concepts from one thing and you attach it to another. So obviously in real life you clone a person, they look the exact same, but in the game world you can make a clone of a game and it's not necessarily a direct copy, but it takes a lot of the aspects and things of that nature from that and attach it to another concept. So, of course, I've talked a lot about Resident Evil. Resident Evil is a fantastic game series that has been cloned hundreds of times, possibly even thousands. So, there are tons of Resident Evil clones that you probably don't even realize are Resident Evil clones, or maybe you do know that they're clones, but you're like, well, I mean, they're kind of their own thing, so are they really? But basically, guys, I'm going to talk about 5 Resident Evil clones that I have personally played and that I do typically enjoy, but I'd also want to talk about some aspects that were transitioned from, Resident Evil to these other clones. So if you hear me talking pretty fast, I do apologize, but let's get right into it. Today, guys, we're going to talk about some Resident Evil clones that I do enjoy. Starting off at the top of our conversation today is Dino Crisis, and I almost said Jurassic Park, but basically Dino Crisis is Jurassic Park the game. Basically, Dino Crisis is a Resident Evil clone made by Capcom, because basically it's Resident Evil is dinosaurs. Dino Crisis has, I believe, 3 entries to the series, 1, 2, and 3. I think the third one has a little catch on there or something, but 1 and 2 follows the titular character Regina. Regina, you can actually get a skin for her in Resident Evil 3 once you've beaten the game and unlocked the boutique key. But Resident Evil definitely lent a lot of assets to the Dino Crisis game, for sure. Basically tank-style controls, and as well as just the general survival horror concept, and sort of the storyline in a way kind of follows a similar path, if you will. But definitely it's still it's a very fun game. I mean, again, it's dinosaur Resident Evil. I will say that this game doesn't necessarily revolve around the concept of resource management at all. Basically, you can walk around the entirety of the map, and there are little computer consoles that you can regenerate your health and other items as well as weapons, and you can also purchase new weapons. So really, you're not having any issues with item or weapon management in this, because you basically have unlimited ammo. And a majority of the enemies are very easy to kill. Obviously, there are some boss enemies that you can't necessarily kill right away, but definitely the game is fairly easy in that respect. Honestly, the hardest part about this game, in my opinion, is kind of the backtracking aspect, because this does a lot of backtracking. So I probably won't spend as much time on later games that I'm going to talk about, but Dino Crisis specifically is very interesting because it's a clone made by the people who made Resident Evil. So, very cool. But that being said, Resident Evil lent a lot of assets to Dino Crisis. Capcom obviously was very liberal with their application of that over, but Dino Crisis nonetheless is a very good game. Feel free to try it out. Either you can find some sort of way to play it online, or you can probably find it at a local thrift shop if you have a PlayStation 1 or 2. But that being said, we're going to move on to our next Resident Evil clone, The Evil Within. So you have never played a game unless you... honestly, The Evil Within, in my opinion, is... oh man, The Evil Within in a way is better than Resident Evil, but it's also a clone of Resident Evil. The Evil Within 1 has some issues, honestly. The first game is very fun, very good, but honestly, it's not a very old game, but it hasn't aged well, in my opinion. The Evil Within 2 is honestly a very good game as well. In my opinion, the Evil Within 2 game really smoothed out the edges, in a way, of the first game. There are some issues that I knew with the first game, but regardless, Evil Within, it very much is a clone of later Resident Evil entries, such as Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7. I think the first Evil Within may have came out before 7, but regardless, the air, the vibes, the feel of those games are very reminiscent of the Evil Within. Evil Within's a very interesting game. I would definitely call the Evil Within probably one of the better clones. In my opinion, the Evil Within, it has a more of a dream-esque sequence because, of course, the Evil Within follows our titular character going into a hospital and being put under the influence of some sort of psychic entity. So it definitely follows more of a supernatural-esque ideology, more of a less than a monster ideology, because, of course, the Resident Evil franchise is more about monsters, right? More about science and Frankenstein's monster, right? And then, of course, this game in turn is more of an internal development. It's all about, psychokinetic stuff. Basically people are being controlled and put into these, dream devices. And, it's very interesting on how the game works. I'm not going to give you too much in terms of spoilers for that, but I would definitely recommend playing the Evil Within. It's very weird, very creepy, very dream-esque. And honestly, the second game is a very true to life continuation of the franchise. It's very, very fun, and in my opinion, it may be even more fun than the first game. So try the Evil Within if you have not yet, but we're going to move on to our next Resident Evil clone. So this game kind of falls in a same delineation of that of the Evil Within, but we're going to talk about The Last of Us. So The Last of Us, if you've never played it, I'm sure you've heard of it. If you've never heard of it, then you're living under a rock. There's been a lot of controversy about The Last of Us 2. I enjoyed The Last of Us 2, where I've not finished it, of course. But the first Last of Us, of course, is a fantastic milestone game from Naughty Dog. If you've never played it, just a little brief description. Basically, The Last of Us follows Ellie and... oh my god, what is his name? Well, anyways, basically it follows two main characters. It follows your male character that I cannot remember the name of, and Ellie. And this is how you know I do one-take videos, because I never remember names, and when I do, I'm very surprised. Anyways, we follow these characters. Ellie is infected by the virus that is attacking the world, which is the cordyceps. It's basically a viral form of like a fungus. Cordyceps is a fungus, if you didn't know that. It's actually a real thing, fun fact. Maybe I'll do a video about that sometime. But anyways, so basically Ellie is infected with this, but she is immune. Long story short, they're trying to get her to this group of scientists to attempt to make a vaccine of some kind to hopefully try and find a cure for the human race, which is all fine and dandy, but maybe perhaps the surgery to make the vaccine isn't going to turn out real well. But regardless, that's essentially the entire purpose of this game, is that we're talking about these two people trekking across the post-apocalyptic America in an attempt to try and make a vaccine. So honestly, this game has a lot of really positive aspects, and in my opinion, really it lives up to the name of a Resident Evil clone, if you will, because this game is very much like a zombie-esque game. This game, of course, has different itemization issues. So, for instance, in this game, you have to typically create your resources, right? You have to collect pieces to create your resources, such as health kits, Molotov cocktails, traps, weapons, and your bullet collection is very much limited as well. You pick up a handful of bullets from enemies, or you can find a handful of bullets in a drawer somewhere. But regardless, that's sort of the air of this game, is that resource management is incredibly important, and basically you have to be smart, and you have to monitor your resources, because you have to create additional resources in an attempt to make the game work in your favor. Creating health items, creating additional attack and weapon items, and Molotov cocktails, pipe bombs, whatever the case may be. Same thing goes for, of course, the second Last of Us game. Joel, his name is Joel, by the way, Joel and Ellie, good lord. But the second Last of Us game follows a very similar concept. Obviously the story is a little bit different, but I'm not going to get into that too much. But The Last of Us is definitely a clone to an extent of Resident Evil, because it definitely shares a lot of elements of a resourceful survival horror game, from which Resident Evil has pioneered. But that being said, if you've never played The Last of Us, just play it. It's great. You'll love it. But we're going to move on to the next one. Dead Space. So this one is a little more of a reach, in my opinion. Honestly, long story short, I'm not going to talk about this too much because, you know, I like Dead Space, but this one, in my opinion, it has a little bit of a harder reach, in my opinion. But Dead Space is like Resident Evil in space. I mean, really, that's what it is. This one has a very unique setting that obviously didn't take from Resident Evil. This one has a survival horror aspect because resource management is important. This one has a lot of puzzles and survival horror elements. Obviously, this game is unique because it is in space, and it's definitely a different title. I won't say it is a 100% hardcore, no stops clone of Resident Evil, but there are some elements of the game that are taken from Resident Evil and applied to this game. Now, obviously, Dead Space is, in my opinion, probably one of the most unique of these games because it definitely follows what I would say is a very interesting story for that of, you know, aliens. I mean, really, when was the last time we had a really fun alien game that was action-y survival horror? And I feel like Dead Space really cornered the market on this, and in my opinion, they really reached an epitome of awesomeness when they did Dead Space 2. Dead Space 3 is all right, in my opinion. Dead Space 1 has a lot of issues, but then they were polished off in Dead Space 2. Very similar to the Evil Within. Evil Within had some issues. They polished it off in the second one. And they are actually, from what I've heard, making a third one. So that would be interesting to see if and when it comes out. But that being said, if you've never played Dead Space, it, long story short, sort of follows a hive mind-like creature that is trying to take over various civilizations using a sort of parasite-esque monster that can attack and take over humans and things of that nature. And honestly, it gives me kind of the Thing vibes. You know, it's kind of unless it's not in Alaska, it's in space, but you know how it goes. Or was the Thing in Alaska? I don't know. I've not seen the Thing in a while. But that being said, the Dead Space game is very interesting. It's very unique, I will say. Not a hardcore, no-stop clone of Resident Evil. But definitely, if you've never played Dead Space, I would highly recommend it. In fact, if you want to play Dead Space, you can check it out on Xbox Games Pass. So, check that out if you will. And we're going to move into our final Resident Evil clone. And this one, in my opinion, is probably the worst offender of all of these. And not in a bad way, because the series that I'm going to talk about next is great. But let's talk about the number one, in my opinion, clone of Resident Evil. Last and certainly not least is Silent Hill. If you didn't think I was going to talk about Silent Hill, you were very poorly mistaken. And like I said, Silent Hill is probably the worst offender about this. I mean, it's a Konami IP that was incredible. I mean, Silent Hill did a lot of the things that Resident Evil did, but they improved upon them. Silent Hill is a very different game series than Resident Evil. And part of that difference comes from the fact that we're talking about more of a supernatural enemy than that of Resident Evil. Resident Evil follows a very linear line, typically. Obviously, some of the later games get a little dicey, but it's all based on the T-Virus, right? The T-Virus is the ultimate end-all, be-all goal. I feel like the only game that really didn't talk about some variation or generation of the T-Virus was Resident Evil 4 when they talked about Las Plagas. Even Resident Evil 5 has a reach back to that of the T-Virus because they're in Africa. That's where the progenitor virus started, right? But that being said, probably the worst offender when it comes to being a clone of Resident Evil is Silent Hill. And not to say, again, that Silent Hill is bad, because it isn't, but the Silent Hill games are very reminiscent of that of Resident Evil. Silent Hill is a paranormal, supernatural, survival horror game that focuses on resource management, puzzles, tank controls, and everything else that you would find in a Resident Evil game. Again, not to say that any of these elements are specifically Resident Evil elements, but they did pioneer that concept. So Silent Hill definitely takes a lot of that information, takes it into their own hands, boils it down, recreates it in the image in which they want to create it. And of course, I love Silent Hill. Silent Hill is probably one of my favorite survival horror games of all time, especially those old games. I mean, those old games, in my opinion, still hold up to today, and that, in my opinion, is probably the best thing about it. The fact that these old games hold up so well is what makes it so great. But I'm not going to continue to rant on that. If you've never played Silent Hill, I would highly recommend going back and starting any of the old games. I would start with something from 1 through 4. 1 through 4 are the pioneer games, in my opinion. Obviously, Silent Hill 1 is probably one of those games that it was rough around the edges, but really got polished off in Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2, in my opinion, is the better of the first two games. And then Silent Hill 3 sort of takes on a more action aspect, and Silent Hill 4 continues that spook factor by honestly really vamping up the horrific body horror of the nature of the game. But that being said, play Silent Hill, play all of these Resident Evil clones, because you will not be sorry, because Resident Evil is great, and Resident Evil clones are great as well. I hope you guys enjoyed. Obviously, I wanted to just talk about this because I actually, like I mentioned previously, I actually watched something the other day that was talking about Resident Evil clones, and I really wanted to touch on that because there are a lot of games that take inspiration from early and late Resident Evil games. In my opinion, there are 3 generations of Resident Evil. You have the original tank-style controls, you have the modern era, or the new modern era, which is all of the more recent games like 7 and 8. And then you have that sort of middle era that was sort of 4, 5, 6, and some of those games in that realm as well. But these different IPs that we talked about, these different entities from various companies, definitely took inspiration from Resident Evil. Dino Crisis being a literal clone of Resident Evil made by Capcom, all the way to Silent Hill, a age-old story from Konami that, in my opinion, has also helped to pioneer the survival horror industry. But that being said, if you guys did enjoy it, let me know in the comment section down below. If you didn't enjoy it, let me know as well. Hit us up on social media. You can tweet at us or go on Facebook. That, of course, is in the description and at the end of the video. And I'm also on Twitter, and that is in those areas as well. And, of course, if you want to join the crew, let us know. We're always looking to expand our content and continue to provide the viewers with newer and better content every day, all night. So, that being said, I hope you guys are staying safe. I hope you guys are staying healthy, staying awesome. And you know what? We'll catch you in the next one. See ya.